African News Review on Adesoji Speaks Knowledge. This is our weekly conversation about news in Africans' news in the Western media, and we get to deconstruct the story. I'm your host, as usual, Adesoji Iginla, and with me is none other than journalist and publisher, Black Star News, a broadcaster with WBAI 99.5 New York Radio. He teaches history at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. He holds degrees in journalism and economics from Columbia and Syracuse universities, respectively. He's currently going back to the school, still hitting the books for his doctorate in African history. His book, Manufacturing Hate, is what inspired this program. And I speak of no other than Comrade Milton Allimadi. Welcome, Comrade.
Asante sana. Thank you, Comrade.
Yes. First things first, what's your general assessment of the news around the world vis-a-vis Africa as you see it, before we delve into today's stories?
Well, the focus the last 2 weeks has been on Congo.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's a lot going on in Sudan as well, so we cannot take our eyes off Sudan just because the current focus is on Congo. I mean, obviously, Congo has the potential to explode in a very horrific way.
Yeah.
But Sudan is already horrific as we speak right now.
Okay. That said, let's go to our first story, which comes from Radio Deutsche Welle, the German broadcaster. And they head up, and their news is titled DRC, EU, France condemns attack on embassies. France has led European Union's condemnation of attacks on embassies in Kinshasa. Germany said it has cancelled planned consultations with Rwanda over alleged support for the M23 rebels, whose advance sparked the violence. And you can see some footage of what has transpired so far. And I'll continue. A spokesman for the EU Foreign Affairs Chief Kajas Kallas said in Brussels that the bloc was calling for the protection of diplomatic missions in accordance with Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. The Belgian, Dutch, Kenyan, Rwandan, Ugandan, and US embassies have also been attacked by protesters as hundreds of thousands of people flee amid fightings in the eastern part of the country. Can you just speak to why these specific countries were targeted as part of? Yeah.
Well, the Congolese people perceive them as condoning the invasion of Congo by Rwanda.
Yep.
Under the guise of M23.
Okay.
So that is why those countries were specifically targeted. They did not target the South African embassy because obviously South Africa is part of the intervention force that has been deployed by SADC, which is the South African Regional Economic Grouping.
Yep.
Deployed by SADC to the Eastern Congo. They're not attacking the embassy of Ghana. They're not attacking the embassy of Nigeria. They're not attacking the embassy of Togo, Gabon, Burkina Faso. So it's obviously for a specific reason. And they perceive these countries as either condoning or indirectly supporting Rwanda in its intervention into the Congo. And that is why, and I would like to add that all of them should condemn just as strongly the invasion of Congo by Rwanda, just as they're condemning very strongly the attacks on their embassies, which of course nobody should condone. Embassies should not be attacked because those are sovereign territories of the specific countries. But at the same time, national borders are also sovereign.
Okay, I'll continue. The U.S. citizens urged to leave is the headline of this section. And Due to an increase in violence throughout the city of Kinshasa, the U.S. Embassy in Kinshasa advised U.S. citizens to shelter in place and then safely depart while commercial options are available, read a statement from the U.S. Embassy, urging their citizens to leave. But I'll continue. Kinshasa resembles a battlefield. People are gathering and they started to set the Rwandan embassy on fire. They started to burn tires, they started to riot, and they have to drop this part in. The police came, started to disperse the crowd with shots, and the crowd moved on and began looting supermarkets. By the end of the day, the city looked devastated. You want to add something?
There's not really much to add there. I just want to reiterate to listeners that are with us and listening. Embassies should not be attacked because they're vulnerable, right?
Yeah, correct.
Because if people start attacking embassies, it means foreign nationals that represent their governments in the various countries can be physically attacked and easily killed because they would not have any protection.
True.
So that is why attacking embassies is a no-go, should never be condoned or supported by anybody. But at the same time, obviously, we should have put it in context. We know the reason why they're taking their wrath against these embassies. Yeah. And you don't want it to ever reach that position. But at least this time around, I'm seeing that most of the language coming from the countries that are seen as having been supportive of Rwanda have been firm in saying that the invasion will not be tolerated and the occupation of Goma by Rwanda's proxy army, which is the M23, cannot be tolerated and must be reversed. So that has been encouraging. Whether the attacks on the embassy had anything to do with that strong language, that is something that I'm not, I don't know.
Okay. Okay. Continue. So you can see a picture of the goings on, and it goes on. The protests are in response to the advance of Rwanda's backed M23 into Goma, a major city in the country's conflicted turn east. Protesters are demanding that the international community pressure Rwanda over its alleged involvement. We denounce the hypocrisy of the international community, Timothy Tishmi, one of the protesters. They must tell Rwanda to stop this adventure. And we take one final piece. On Tuesday, Colonel Nyanga, leader of the AFC Rebel Alliance that includes the M23, I must add that he contested the presidency against Felix Tshisekedi and has flipped. So, leader of the AFC Rebel Alliance that includes the M23 told Reuters news agency that Goma airport was in rebel hands, which is also confirmed by diplomatic and security sources. They have also taken control of the airport. M23s are there, fighters are there. Another security source told the AFP news agency, adding that more than 1,200 Congolese soldiers have surrendered. Why is that important to underscore? This surrendering.
Okay, so there are a number of points there I want to point on just briefly. Number one, over Rwanda's alleged involvement, right?
Okay.
Yet at the same time, the article did not say Rwanda's alleged backed M23. They specifically say Rwanda backed M23. And yet in the same article, they're still saying over its alleged involvement.
Yeah, so which is, yeah.
These people, they think people are as stupid as some of these writers,
Well, would you put that down to the editor or the writer? The writer.
Well, that comes when you're trying to be dishonest, you see? Because if you're honest, then you would not catch yourself making such a faux pas, right? Because once you already said Rwanda backed M23, it means it is Rwanda backed M23.
And you be consistent throughout your piece.
In a previous article, you had probably used over Rwanda's alleged involvement. So you forgot to take that out, you see? You just copied and pasted it from. Yeah, this is about too much, right?
I mean, it's the news. The news article is free, so probably they thought they could get away with it. But unfortunately, you know,
when you lie, you try to be dishonest. Sometimes, you know, you just trap yourself, you know, and you leave the evidence behind. That confirms to people that you know the truth, but yet you're still trying to lie. Okay, that's number one. Number two, it is not mentioned, something that you introduced, the fact that the leader of one of the militias that make up this conglomeration of armies fighting against the Congolese had stood for the election as well.
Yep.
That's a very, very relevant point because it goes to the motive. It explains the motive. Are you telling me that, you know, here in the United States, let's say Kamala loses election,
and
then she's suddenly supposedly leading a quote-unquote rebel army coming in from Canada? That would not be a relevant point to bring out. That, by the way, Kamala also run against Trump. It's amazing, man. But thank you for bringing that up, because once again, it exposes the sinister media propaganda. Let me see if there's any other point. Those are the key points. But you know what? I think Rwanda's really playing with fire. It really is.
I mean, as we go through the stories that we have lined up for today, you will see almost the recurring theme. And I don't want to, you know, expose the hand first. So we continue and we go to your favorite newspaper, the New York Times, who lead with what is M23? It says Rwandan-backed group fighting in Eastern Congo. The militia seized the pivotal city of Goma, threatening a new humanitarian crisis in a region that has suffered decades of fighting. The story is filed by Ilian Peltier, reporting from Dakar, Senegal. Okay. So
first of all, I want to take issue with that, number one. Why should somebody in Dakar, Senegal, be reporting on anything happening in Rwanda? So what's the difference between me reporting it from here in Washington, D.C.? What's the difference? He's not on the ground. You know, they shouldn't have that. At the very least, get even a freelancer to report from the region. And use a freelancer. If your guy doesn't want to fly, go out there because he has better things to do in Dakar, or because he's afraid of going there, you know, this is an insult. You know, you would not file a story about a conflict between Ukraine and Russia by somebody in Dakar, Senegal, or somebody in Paris, in France, right? Yeah. That would not be acceptable. So why do you do it for an African country? That's complete nonsense.
Okay, interesting. Let's continue. So some 400,000 people have fled their homes in Eastern Congo as the rebels advance on Goma, according to the UN Refugee Agency. In the last few days, many have arrived in the city. So you don't know, you're being told. M23 is funded directly by the government of Rwanda, according to the United Nations and the United States. Rwanda denies any involvement with the group. The conflict has its roots in Rwanda's 1994 genocide, which spilled over the border into Congo, leading to decades of fighting. Like the leaders of Rwanda, M23 is made mostly of the people from the Tutsi ethnic group. You want to say a word or two?
I just want to say the allusion to the 1994 genocide. Okay, so let's say we're talking, what, 31 years now, right?
Correct.
So let's say there were fighters who were in their 20s, right? So you're telling me that Rwanda's army is fighting against people who are in their 50s now? you know?
You're too much of a skeptic.
No, really, because they keep cutting and pasting the same information from 30 years ago. At that time, obviously, it was much more relevant when Kagame had taken power in Rwanda and that military that it defeated had fled to the Congo.
Yep.
And yes, they were still fighting back, you see? That's 30 years ago. Those fighters were in their 20s, right?
Yep.
So you're telling me that those same fighters who would now be in their 50s are still the ones that you're going after? You know, come on, man. So in terms of sequencing information, it's very critical to stories, right?
Yep.
They tend to bury the lead. The lead should be honest, that the reason why Rwanda is backing this conflict is because it wants the minerals.
Correct.
This is widely known and clearly known to this New York Times reporter, even if he's in Dakar. There's information available, even if you're in Dakar, correct?
Correct, yeah.
There's information available that Rwanda exports $1 billion worth of minerals that it does not produce. It exports much more in terms of the value, but it earns for itself $1 billion US dollars based on resources plundered from the Congo. So you're telling me that's not something that you should be, by now, we should know that by now?
Be singing that
you are leading,
by heart.
Instead, you're leading with a story from 30 years ago. The Hutu militia who committed genocide in Rwanda. That is still the lead, really? Above the $1 billion in plundered resources? Plundered resources, and the cost of plundering that resources, people are being killed today, contemporary.
Yes.
And you are diminishing that in your story, you see? So we need to catch them. And the New York Times is not just any ordinary newspaper. It employs some of the best writers, some of the smartest people, some of the smartest editors. So when they do that, it means they're also going along with the agenda, you know? It's not by accident.
Could you also speak to the part where it says the M23 is funded and directed by the government of Rwanda, according to the United Nations and the United States, yet Rwanda denies any involvement with the group? So are they saying the United States information with its eyes everywhere?
No, there's nothing wrong with saying that Rwanda denies that, but you can add that the denial rings hollow, given the facts on the ground. He could easily add that.
Yeah.
And they should add that in future if they're listening to our program right now. Anybody can say anything. No, really, you can get caught with the money in your hands. You can say, no, I didn't steal it. You know, and you can say he said he didn't steal it, even though he was holding the money. You know? So they should stop playing games with us. We are not going to tolerate it. We don't accept it because African lives are being exterminated.
Yeah.
So don't give us your nonsense.
So I continue. So what is M23? M23 is one of the 100 militias roaming the mineral-rich areas of the Eastern Congo.
No, it is not. And by saying that, it's also diminishing the fact that this is actually what could comprise, what essentially is Rwanda's army, you see? So by saying, oh, the region is okay, I'll take the 100 militias, this just happens to be one of them. You see? That's absolute nonsense. You know, you have fish, and then you have a whale. A whale is a fish as well, correct?
Correct, yeah.
But you can't say a whale is one of the 99 other fishes. When the other 99 are tilapia and sardines, you know? Come on now. Don't play with us, New York Times. We're smarter than that. Shame on you.
Wow.
I hope you don't repeat that analysis in your next article.
You know what they will do.
You know, we know the tricks inside and out, and what we want is for our listeners to learn how to expose their tricks as well, so that they can share it with other listeners, other viewers, You can go and say, oh, you know what? When they had the discussion on Adesoji Speaks, they pointed out that particular reference and cut and pasted and sent it to your compatriots so that all of us are teaching each other to know how to fight the enemies of Africa.
True, true. So it continues. The group's name referred to its claim that Congolese government failed to honor an earlier peace agreement signed on March 23, 2009. The leaders of the M23 claim that the group is in Eastern Congo to protect
Let me also correct him again. It's complete nonsense. And that's why I read that sentence before, and let me deconstruct it for you.
Okay. The group's name referred to its claim that the Congolese government failed to honor an earlier peace agreement signed on March 23, 2009.
Okay, so now, and this is one of the most dishonest writers that we've been critiquing lately, right? It's claimed that the Congolese government, blah, blah, blah. But you know what actually happened? They were integrated into the national army.
Yep.
And they mutinied and abandoned and left. So for you to write its claim when you know its claim is not correct, and then not to correct it that this is actually what happened, it shows you have an agenda. This is very evil. It's very evil.
Wow.
And we hope that the writer is listening. We won't allow him to repeat it in his next article. You know? It goes back to the thief saying, I didn't steal it while holding the money. So yeah, no wonder it did not say the group's name refers to the Congolese government's failure to honor an earlier peace agreement, because he knows, the writer knows, it was not the Congolese government that failed. So it goes with, it refers to its claim, even though the writer knows the claim is incorrect, but does not tell the reader. That is very malicious.
And yet in the paragraph before, he cited a researcher with 15 years experience in Eastern Congo who teaches at Utrecht University, who said they pose more of a threat to Congo than any other armed group. She could have told you.
She must have told him.
Exactly.
And he just probably did not use it and cropped the rest of the quote. You know? No, really. I really know how to read the New York Times now. But we know how to read newspapers generally.
True.
Particularly Western media, you know? If I did not know that M23 were the ones who abandoned that peace agreement, I would not be able to counter his propaganda. You see? I just knew it for a fact. That's why I know when he says it refers to its claim, I know that the claim is incorrect, and I know the writer knows the claim is incorrect as well. Otherwise, he would have said the group's name refers to the Congolese government not honoring, but he knows that the Congolese government actually did honor.
Oh, no, yeah.
Oh, man, these people are very wicked.
Okay, continue. The leader of the M23 claimed the group is in Eastern Congo to protect fellow Tutsis and other speakers of the Kiwanja.
Very good. You see, okay, now let me give a clue to our viewers and listeners. Whenever he says claim, from now on, you know he's hiding something on behalf of the aggressors, right? Yeah. When you see a pattern, every time he says claim, the reality is not the same. I just gave you the example when he claimed that the Congolese government did not honor that agreement. I just happen to know the facts, right? So now take anything that this writer uses claim to paraphrase, you know he's hiding something.
So, but what would be his motivation though?
Oh, I mean, come on. I mean, okay. Access? Right now we are living in a very dangerous time right now. Right now we have in the United States an administration that is backed by some of the wealthiest people in this country, right?
Yeah.
It is not, I would not be shocked if some of the people who are supporting the administration
of interest
are beneficiaries of some of the resources that are being stolen from the Congo and shipped via Rwanda, correct?
Yep.
That's one part of it.
Yep.
I would not be surprised if some of these individuals are very influential and read the New York Times. And I would not be surprised if some of the writers or editors of the New York Times are also aware that some of the influential people that are either associated with the New York Times or people that should not be exposed to embarrassment, whatever influence or connection, I would not be shocked if there is some association with the way the article is written and some beneficiaries of the stolen resources from the Congo. I don't have the evidence for direct tie-in, but I know generally nothing happens for nothing. That's what I'm willing to say.
Because, I mean, that's why I'm prompted to ask the question, that what would be the motivation? Because, again...
Nothing happens for nothing, but normally, for good investigative reporters, for good investigators generally, for people who connect dots generally, when things are not adding up, that's where you get the incentive to do more research. So I'm saying something like this deserves more research.
Okay. Okay. So I'll continue. The UN, the United Nations, has repeatedly warned against widespread hate speech against Tutsis in Eastern Congo and said last year, offering justification and cover. Go ahead.
No, finish the sentence.
Okay, and the United Nations has repeatedly warned against widespread hate speech against Tutsis in Eastern Congo and said last year the risk of genocide and atrocity crimes in the region remains high.
Okay, so that may be 100% true, what the United Nations did, correct?
Okay.
But you're telling me that you're going to elevate that at a time when actual genocide is being committed by the Rwanda invasion and M23. Think about that. No, think about that.
Yeah.
It's like, I don't even want to add on that.
Offering justification. Yeah.
Of course.
Cover and justification.
Of course, the same thing why we started off with the 1994 genocide.
Genocide, yeah.
Which everybody, of course, condemns. But they're trying to trap you into saying you can't analyze it. If you analyze it and you put it in context, you're somehow approving genocide. So they're trying to trap you with that trick, you see? Nobody could support hate speech. Of course, we all denounce it. But at the same time, actual genocide is happening at this moment, you see? So this writer is very disturbing, to be honest with you. His motives are very questionable.
Wow. The power of words, isn't it? This is
absolutely
the power of words.
The power of words, and that is why we can't read blindly. We cannot. We can't afford to. And obviously, Congolese on the ground in Goma, the surrounding areas who are being exterminated right now, they're not in a position to critique this guy who's sitting in some comfortable location in Dakar and writing this.
Overlooking the Atlantic
without any thought for the impact of his words on the situation on the ground, because obviously, conflicts like this, the words are very critical. The words are very critical. It impacts the situation on the ground, you know. And I'll give you another example.
Go on.
Last week, before Goma had been seized, I was following the headlines of the New York Times, of the Washington Post, CNN, BBC, Reuters, and AP, and Al Jazeera, who were providing most of the major coverage. And the BBC, and I think it was either AP or Reuters and Al Jazeera, and most of them kept referring to M23 rebels in the headlines, M23 rebels, right? Particularly the BBC. Even after the UN Secretary General, Guterres, had directly called out Rwanda.
Yeah.
So I started tweeting and referring to the BBC as the Ministry of Propaganda, still referring exclusively to M23
as a rebel group.
And I tagged, on X, I would also tag Guterres and his spokesperson, and Marco Rubio, the U.S. Secretary of State, and SADC Secretariat, as well as Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa. I did that for 3 days in a row. On the fourth day, the BBC had a headline for the first time linking M23 to Rwanda. You see? So what am I saying? I'm saying to viewers, I'm saying to listeners, start doing that. Call them out. In the modern technology era, you don't have to be a massive media organization. You don't have to have an organization with hundreds of thousands of followers. You just have to know how to counter them and keep questioning the BBC. Why are you constantly just talking to M23 about M23 in your headlines? And you're not mentioning the fact that this is essentially a Rwanda proxy army. And then contrast with other headlines. By that time, most of the other outlets were now directly saying Rwanda linked M23 or Rwanda backed M23. And you can take those other headlines from other media and take the images and put them next to the BBC one. And of course, make sure you also put at BBC so that the BBC is also reading those tweets, you see? And then tag the other officials that I just named. The UN Secretary General, the UN Secretary General spokesperson, and the US Secretary of State, SADC, Ramaphosa, and anybody else that you feel is a relevant player that needs to see you exposing the BBC. And I noticed after that the New York Times has been much more consistent as well of making sure that the headline has
reflects
M23, Rwanda backed in the headline, not buried somewhere in the story. And that is very critical for the world to know.
That's important. You are the guardians of truth with your...
We have to be, all of us.
Yeah. So I will just read one final part. Now, on the question of who is backing the M23. The M23 is under the military command of Sultani Makenga, a Congolese rebel who fought in Rwanda in the 1990s, joined the Congolese army in the 2000s, and then defected to join M23 in 2012. The same story you just said earlier with regards to when the peace deal was signed. They joined the Congolese army. And
yet, after he wrote that, he didn't think it was relevant for him to go back and take out that claim.
Yes.
The reason why the peace deal collapsed. It's amazing. As I said earlier, after we critique the first article, they're so bad at lying that they leave the evidence of their lies within the same story that they're writing. You see? Now you're telling us clearly that he abandoned the agreement. But earlier on, you're saying they claimed it was the Congolese government that did not deliver.
So which is...
I rest my case. We have destroyed this article using his own words, you know? Amazing.
Well, I'll just take one.
And here's the embarrassing thing.
Go on.
You know, the New York Times hires mostly from Harvard, from Princeton,
Yale,
from Yale, right? Columbia, and yet they're telling me that they cannot do a better job in propaganda. Come on now. I hope they learn, because we're not saying these things because we have any personal animus towards them. No,
of course
we're
not.
saying this because we want to force them to do the right thing.
Yeah.
So avoid repeating this propaganda approach in your next article, is all I can tell to this.
I mean, they say...
Otherwise, we will continue to critique and expose you.
And expose, yeah. They also say, newspapers are the first draft of history. The key word being the first draft.
Right.
But if you cannot then correct what you didn't get right in the first piece,
yep,
and then you continue, then we know it's intentional. Then
right.
we know
and then other researchers are going to come and continue the distortion when they do research and they read you 10 years from now, 20 years from now.
Thinking, I just captured this last bit here. Mr. Makenga receives instruction and support from the Rwandan army and from Rwandan intelligence services, according to United Nations experts and Congolese and Western intelligence agencies.
Okay, so the other issue I would say now is readers and listeners and viewers, should this not be one of the first sentences in his article? Should that not have been the case? Right? Instead, it's buried toward the end of the story. But much earlier, we are reading about M23 alleged that the Congolese government did not honor an agreement. We read that much earlier, right?
Yes.
We read much earlier about the UN talking about hate speech, right?
Yes.
We read much earlier about the 1994 genocide, right?
Yeah.
Which, of course, was horrific 31 years ago. But something that's happening now, and the fact that now, as we speak, U.S. intelligence and the UN, and by the way, the U.S. actually supports the Rwanda government.
Exactly.
But at the same time, they're saying, pointing them out at the same time, and you're burying this in your article. Come on now. You have an agenda. You're not a good person, I'm sorry to say.
Wow. Speaking of calling out, we go to the next story, which comes from The Guardian. And it's that the France seeks UN resolutions naming Rwanda as the backer of the M23 in DRC. And the first lead says M23 lightning advance into East DRC being supported by up to 4,000 Rwandan troops, said UN officials. You notice we didn't see any of this in the previous stories we read.
No.
France is seeking Western support for a UN security resolution that names Rwanda as being behind the M23 rebel group attacks inside the Democratic Republic of Congo, including the surprise weekend seizure of parts of Goma. We now know it's been seized, the largest city in eastern DRC. UN officials have said as many as 4,000 Rwandan troops were escorting the M23 rebels. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres on Sunday called on the Rwandan Defense Forces to stop supporting the M23 and to withdraw from the territory of the DRC. It was his clearest statement of Rwanda's responsibility for much of the violence.
Okay, so you don't have to be in New York City, right, where the UN is located to have access to this information, correct?
Correct.
Guterres does not come and stand on the lobby and make this statement to only people who are within listening distance, correct?
Correct.
This information is widely available to even people on the ground in Goma. So this information was available to the New York Times writer as well. So why did he not frame his story the way The Guardian did? Because The Guardian is supported and funded by readers.
Readers, yeah.
The Guardian does not have a corporate interest in whatever is going on in the region.
Correct.
You see? And that goes back to what I said earlier. I said, I don't have the evidence, But the way that article in the New York Times is framed, it seems there might be some connection with some entity that is benefiting from the resources coming out of the Congo illegally through Rwanda. I said I would not be surprised, but I don't have any evidence. But I also said nothing happens for nothing. And now when I read The Guardian and I see that they're framing it the correct way, without massaging, without burying the lead, now my suspicion is even much more deeper that there's some agenda involved in the way the New York Times is shaping this same story.
Okay. Let's continue. And the French ambassador at the UN, Nicolas de Vere, urged the UN Security Council to say Rwanda's actions were a grave threat to regional peace and security. He said it was time to call a cat, a reference to the way in which the international community, for different reasons, have skirted around the issue of Rwanda's role in arming the M23.
Okay, I like that. I like that, the way you phrased it, If the international community is, meandering around, it is not obligatory for the New York Times to also meander around. No, it is not.
So what you're saying is the New York Times...
Just because governments are meandering around, dancing around the graves of dead Congolese, the New York Times is not obligated to also dance around the graves of dead Congolese. That's not the mission of a newspaper or a media outlet. You do your role and let the government do their propaganda if they want.
Wow. I'll continue. The Britain and the US, in their intervention at the UN on Sunday, also called Rwanda and urged Kagame to pull back. It goes on to say, Britain, France, and the US have been reluctant to impose sanctions on Kagame. Why would you think that's the case?
Obviously, there are commercial interests involved.
Yes.
There are many commercial interests.
The UK became dependent on Rwanda's goodwill when it signed an agreement for Rwanda to accept asylum seekers, but the scheme collapsed in the face of legal and political objections. France has been grateful to Rwanda for policing the Central African Republic and Mali, both former French colonies. The EU, now I didn't know that. They were in Mali?
That's news to me.
That's interesting.
I knew there was Central African Republic.
Yeah, I knew there was, exactly. I mean, wow, okay. You see what comes out when... So both former French colonies, the EU in 2023 signed a mineral pact with Rwanda. The US has rarely seen Africa as a diplomatic priority. And one of the first steps of his new president, Donald Trump, was to freeze all aid to the continent. Yet Rwanda would be vulnerable to a coordinated aid withdrawal since a third of Rwanda's budget is dependent on overseas aid.
Yes.
What do you say to that?
Well, there's not much to add there. It shows you indeed the only way Rwanda can continue its war of aggression in the Congo is if there is a foreign acquiescence and support.
And then
so to the extent that we see the aggression continue in the Congo, it also means that foreign acquiescence is also continuing. You can't have it both ways,
And it's almost a signal that Rwanda is getting desperate, and in order to forestall losing access to said aid, it needs to look for alternative sources of resources. And so, go on.
Well, that's not the ideal way to get it, by having a permanent state of war in the region. You can't have that. And failing having a permanent state of war, say plan B, let's annex the region. You can't have that either, because there will be war of annexations all over the African continent. You know,
Mm.
many every African country has a border issue, right?
Yeah.
We are all for a borderless Africa, but it has to be done by agreements of the
Mutual
African
agreement.
peoples. And
Yeah,
that
mutual
can be
agreement.
done. And that is, in fact, what philosophically I believe in. It must happen. There should be a borderless Africa. But this is not the way to do it. By killing other Africans and stealing their resources. That's not acceptable.
Mm. Okay, that's it. One final part. Where is it? Yes. It's that William Ruto, the president of Kenya, is seeking to fill the diplomatic vacuum by calling an extraordinary summit of the East African Community, which he chairs within 48 hours on Monday, which was last Monday. He insisted that the DRC president, President Tshisekedi, and Kagame would attend, but there has been no confirmation of this. Some nations, notably Russia and China, as well as the African nations holding rotating seats on the Security Council, are content to issue generalized call for restraint. Russia said the dispute is rooted in colonialism, a comprehensive critique it provides to analyze most Western actions in Africa. However, one final thought, the DRC Foreign Minister, Therese Kiyawama Wagner, rejected any history lessons, instead favoring the UN imposing sweeping economic and political sanctions on Kagame, including on all Rwanda labeled minerals, which
Yeah.
she accused Rwanda of a declaration of war and no longer hiding under diplomatic maneuvers, adding that it was clear that this crisis is directly linked to the economic plunder of our country by Rwanda. Over to you.
I think it's going to be very difficult for Rwanda to get away with this because remember, Congo is a part of that deal with the Benguela Railway and all
Yeah.
that.
Lobito.
Congo is much, much more valuable to Rwanda than to the U.S. than Rwanda is really. Rwanda, the concern would be humanitarian catastrophe. The concern would be that if there's a counter, uh, and the proxy army M23 is pushed back into Rwanda, it might cause some conflagration within Rwanda itself. So that's obviously a concern, and nobody wants to see that. But in terms of economically, and of course, we know this, the new US President Trump responds to money, and his advisors, convince him that, listen, these resources that Congo has on the other side, right, not Eastern Congo, are much more vital to our national security. So we need to support the government of the Congo wholeheartedly. That, of course, that's going to be very bad news for Kagame. So perhaps it would be best actually for some mechanism for a much more orderly withdrawal to occur rather than a withdrawal that is done by force, which would just escalate everything. And nobody wants to see that. So the next week is going to be critical going forward. The withdrawal should not be imposed militarily. So we hope it doesn't come to that, because that would not be the best solution. Diplomatic solution is still best, but it's hard to see how Tshisekedi's hands are not tied if you're talking about, oh, we're going to march to Kinshasa, we're going to march to Kinshasa. Because that might put pressure on him. His own colleagues might say, wait, why are you talking to people that say they want to march to Kinshasa? And could imperil his own political position. So
True.
It's bad everywhere. Let's put it that way.
Wow. Speaking of,
and it's also very bad when any major media outlet try to give the impression that this aggression should be condoned and accepted. That's not right.
Okay. So speaking of the fact that media organizations should balk at the idea of someone consolidating territory, we go to for our last and final story. again to your new magazine of choice, The Economist. So,
But
Rwanda's
surprisingly, I
go
would
on.
like to say something. Actually, surprisingly,
Yeah,
The Economist the last few weeks has actually
I've been.
been much better than the BBC. Oh yeah, when you read The Economist and you contrast with the BBC, then you see the clear propaganda of the BBC. You know,
Of the BBC. Yeah, I mean,
and
BBC
then The
is.
Economist is supposed to be the Bible of money, but even The Economist knows that nowadays you cannot justify, economic prosperity based on plunder. Maybe in the 19th century during
Yeah,
colonialism.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So I'll read. Its headline: Rwanda's reckless plan to redraw the map of Africa. The fall of Goma could trigger another Congo conflict. The residents of Goma are no strangers to war. The largest city in the east of the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC, has long been a refuge for those fleeing from violence elsewhere in one of the world's most blood-soaked regions, where more than 100 groups, these more than 100 groups compete for land, loot, and political influence. On January 26th, the most sophisticated of these militias, a group known as M23, brought war to the city itself. Its apparent seizure of Goma, the culmination of more than 2 years of resurgent violence by the previously dormant group, illustrate the enduring weakness of the Congolese state. It is also a worrying sign that M23's patron, Rwanda, may be willing to use its strength to redraw the map of the region, and in so doing, risk another catastrophic war.
Okay, very good. So now I like this. You know why I like this in particular?
Yeah.
For viewers who have been attentive, listeners who are attentive. Now we learn, and let's say we had read this article first before the New York Times.
I wasn't going to
We,
do that
we,
to you.
we would learn that this M23 proxy army is one of 100 other militias, correct?
Correct, yeah.
But here we are told by the economists that the others are sardine and tilapia. M23 is a whale. Why? Because we're informed that it's the patron of the Rwandan state.
Yep.
So you see the difference with how you can use the same information?
Mm.
But in the New York Times reference, it made it appear as this is just 100 of, 100 other bandits that are out there. Nothing special about this particular bandit. In the reference used in the New York Times, using that same 100 militias thing.
Yes, yes.
You see? And that's the difference. The same information can be used for malign intentions sometimes. And that's why you should read many media outlets, because then you can contrast. You will not be able to contrast or compare if you only read the New York Times or if you only read The Economist. But if you have time to read just three, read the New York Times, read The Guardian, read The Economist, and then look how same information is constructed, how the story is framed, and how the narrative progresses, you see?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yes. I'll continue. The origins of events in Goma go back decades. Between 1996 and 2003, Rwanda and other regional powers fought over the spoils left by the dictatorship of Mobutu Sese Seko, who misruled Congo, which he renamed Zaire from 1965 until 1997. Do you want to give them a backstory on that, please?
Well, I mean, hopefully most viewers and listeners know that Mobutu, of course, was the corrupt tyrant who was installed by the West, by Belgium, by the United States, by Britain, supported by all of them during his tyranny. Mm-hmm. He was the murderer of Patrice Lumumba, overthrew Lumumba, with CIA support, of course, in 1960, and then had him exterminated brutally by Moise Tshombe in January 1961. Tshombe, of course, was supported and financed by Belgium, and he declared Katanga, the mineral-rich region, as a separate state and ignited the chaos that the Congo actually is still going through today.
Today, correct.
But obviously that was part two of the chaos. Part one of the chaos was when Belgian terrorism against the people of the Congo started with King Leopold in the 1880s until it was so horrific, so murderous that the Belgian state took away the Congo Free State and made it an official Belgian colony that lasted until 1960. So that is the backstory.
Yes, thank you very much. And that's a short, excuse me, a short history lesson on the Congo that you probably won't get anywhere else whilst you're reading the newspaper and magazine. If this is your first time here, do like, share, subscribe. And also just to inform you, if you want the audio version of this conversation, you can download it wherever you get on all major podcast platforms. And I'll continue. So it goes on. The most important proxy has been M23, which takes its name from the moribund peace deal signed on March 23, 2009 between a previously Tutsi-led group and the Congolese government. In 2012, M23 briefly seized Goma for the first time before being defeated by UN peacekeepers. The groups re-emerged in late 2022 after an attempt by Felix Tshisekedi, Congolese president, to reconfigure regional alliances in a way that could have sidelined Rwanda. Over the past 2 years, it has committed multiple atrocities, including mass essay and murder, while seizing territory across North Kivu and the province of which Goma is the capital.
And also the same information about the atrocities is also available to anyone in Dakar, especially a New York Times correspondent. We can't let them off the hook. We have to keep reminding them, make it difficult for them to propagate the propaganda, because Africans are going to be pushing back.
Yes, at least on this channel, we're going to be doing that most of the time. And so the final piece. The fall of Goma underlines the failure of Mr. Tshisekedi's pledge upon taking office in 2019 to bring peace and order to Eastern Congo. The latest attempt at peace talks intended to stem M23's advance, brokered by Angola, fell apart in December. The Congolese army is corrupt and incompetent. After much of its defensive line collapsed on January 26, grim-faced soldiers have been driving around in jeeps in the center of town looking for ways out of the city. Multilateral efforts have fared little better. The 14,000 UN peacekeepers, known by the acronym MONUSCO, has been undermined by their own track records. They have struggled to keep peace, and several blue helmets has also been accused of SA, as well as Congolese vacillation about whether or not their mandate could be extended, which it ultimately was for a further year in December of 2024. Could you speak to, one, the issue of the UN being in Congo? Two, the fact that, according to reports, they were supposed to have left based on what Mr. Tshisekedi said, that he gave them a year or so to leave. And that would be the end of 2025. And anything else that springs to mind?
Well, I would like to focus on Tshisekedi, actually.
Okay.
And I would like to say this is a colossal failure in national leadership.
Okay.
Right? Congo has resources, and Congo has been exporting from the side that is under his control. How is the national resources being deployed? when you know you have a security crisis in Eastern Congo that could undermine the viability of the entire Congolese state, why do you not have a professional army that is capable of fighting? That is a question that the Congolese people need to examine very carefully. Yes, Rwanda is supported by the West, trained by the West, equipped by the West, but there's no arms embargo against the Congolese. So why have you not been able to develop a sufficient national army as well? That is a question that is worth pondering. Because the way your armed forces just melted on the front line, that's a reason for a serious concern, you know? So it looks like, as we speak right now, his armed forces does not have the capacity to counterattack. Otherwise, it would have already counterattacked by now. So if it's going to be any military shift, it's probably going to be assisted by the foreign intervention armed forces. It would take South Africa probably reinforcing its forces there, and it would probably take an army like Angola, which of course has a very capable armed forces as well. But you're telling me that you're in your second term now. You have not asked any of these intervention forces to train your own capacity and elevate your own capacity. These are questions that need to be asked as well. The internal failures, even while we focus on the external unwanted intervention, you know, the Congolese people have to be very honest and also ask these questions of themselves. Why is our government such a failure? You know, are they focusing on other things except national security? You know, are their priorities just enrichment?
Yeah.
You know, and if that is the case, why should they be rewarded? You see, you can't have external and internal enemies at the same time. The Congolese people don't deserve that, you know.
And speaking of the, speaking of the Congolese people, ever since the episode you mentioned earlier, Leopold being there in the 1800s, that country has been hemorrhaging people on a catastrophic scale.
It must end, and it must end once and for all.
On a catastrophic scale.
It must end.
You know.
It must end.
Yeah. And yes, speaking of ending, we've come to the end of another episode. And again, I have to thank Comrade Milton for coming through, giving us his incredible insights into how the narratives are framed about us, to us.
Yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
And it's also important that we be able to discern, you know, hopefully this episode has contributed to growing that muscle. And it's also imperative that we exercise said critical thinking muscle in order, because like you said earlier, we live in dangerous times and information is critical. Whether you get it or how you digest it is important.
Absolutely.
So, Brother Milton, last words?
A luta continua. We need good victories. We need peace in Africa so that we can use our resources, industrialize, and within 10, 15 years, transform the entire continent.
And for me, it's important that we underscore the fact that not only should we concern ourselves with said resources, but the welfare and well-being of the people. It's imperative.
Yes,
1.3 billion people have suffered enough. They've suffered enough simply because of imperialistic ambitions and, you know,
incompetent leaders.
Yes, they've suffered enough. And yes, thank you everyone for coming through. Again, like I said, if you want the audio version of this podcast, you can download it on all major platforms, podcast platforms on Monday, which is tomorrow, inside of the world. And thank you for coming through. And until next time, good evening for now. Good evening. Yes. Oh, wow. I think with Mr. Trump there, your internet is just...
It's done?
It's boosted. Yeah, it's
okay,
done.
Great. No, let me run to my books, man.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir.
Okay,
Thank you very
be
much.
well.
Thank you. Bye-bye.